money.
Good morning, Lieutenant. This is the man that shot me. He fancies me like mad. Perhaps it is the apron.
What if I told you that one of Britain's most beloved wartime comedies might never have survived in today's cancel culture climate? Back in the 1980s, Allo Allo was the crown jewel of British sitcoms, a hilarious parody set in war-torn France, filled with quirky characters and cheeky jokes. But hidden in its run was a scene so infamous, so controversial, that it's still whispered about today as the reason the show could never continue. What really happened behind that fateful moment? Hold on to your berets, because we're diving deep into the surprisingly scandalous world of Allo Allo, the show that dared to make Hitler's war hilarious, pushed every possible boundary, and somehow got away with it all. Until it didn't. The birth of comedy chaos. It's 1982, and two British comedy writers have the audacious idea to create a sitcom that makes fun of Nazi-occupied France. Sounds like a career-ending move, right? Well, Jeremy Lloyd and David Croft, the masterminds behind Are You Being Served, were about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous ideas make for the most brilliant television. Allo Allo burst onto BBC screens with a premise so outrageous it shouldn't have worked. Set in the fictional French town of Nouvion during World War II, the show centered around René Artois, a cowardly cafe owner caught between resistance fighters, German officers, and his own wandering eye for the waitresses. But here's where things get spicy. This wasn't your typical wartime drama. This was comedy gold, wrapped in controversy, and it was about to become one of the most watched shows in British television history. The show's creators took every sacred cow of wartime television and turned it into comedic fodder. German officers were bumbling fools obsessed with sausages and stealing artwork. French resistance fighters were portrayed as incompetent clowns. Even the British airmen were depicted as upper-class twits, more concerned with tea than escape plans. What made Allo Allo so dangerously brilliant was its commitment to stereotypes. Every single character was an exaggerated caricature that would make today's sensitivity readers break out in cold sweats. The Germans said "what" instead of "what." The French resistance fighters mangled English phrases, and Officer Crabtree's garbled French became legendary, with lines like "good moaning" instead of "good morning." The show's secret weapon? It made fun of everyone equally. No nationality, no group was safe from its satirical blade. In an era where political correctness was just a distant concept, Allo Allo was free to push boundaries that would be unthinkable today. And push they did. From René's multiple affairs to innuendos that sailed right over children's heads but had adults in stitches, the show was a masterclass in cheeky British humor. Lines like, "You stupid woman," and "I was pissing by the door when I heard two shats" became catchphrases that defined a generation.
What are you doing holding that servant girl in your arms?
You stupid woman! Can you not see this poor child is suffering from delayed shock?
The casting was pure genius. Gordon Kaye as René brought a perfect blend of cowardice and charm to the role. Carmen Silvera as his wife, Edith, delivered her tone-deaf singing with such commitment that it became comedically iconic. And who could forget Richard Gibson's portrayal of the sinister yet ridiculous Herr Flick? But perhaps the show's most controversial aspect was its timing. Here was a comedy making light of one of history's darkest periods, and somehow it worked. The show managed to satirize war without trivializing its real horrors, creating a delicate balance that few comedies have ever achieved. Pushing boundaries in the 80s and 90s. Now, let's talk about what made Allo Allo so scandalously entertaining. This show didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them with a cheeky wink and a Listen very carefully. I shall say this only once. The sexual innuendos were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, like Renee's famous paintings. The show was masterful at creating double entendres that would make even the most mature viewer blush. Renee's constant affairs with his waitresses weren't just subplot material. They were central to the show's cheeky charm. Take the famous sausage episodes. The show used food metaphors with such suggestive abandon that it's amazing they got past the BBC censors. Lines about Renee getting his sausage stuck in tight places had parents scrambling for the remote, while kids remained blissfully unaware of the adult humor flying over their heads. The show's treatment of the Nazi regime was perhaps its most daring aspect. At a time when World War II memories were still fresh, Allo Allo dared to make the Third Reich look utterly incompetent. Colonel von Strom and Captain Geering were portrayed as art-obsessed buffoons, more interested in looting than winning the war. Herr Flick, supposedly the most feared Gestapo officer, was shown as a leather-clad caricature with an unhealthy obsession for Renee. The homoerotic undertones in Flick's character would never fly in today's television landscape, where such portrayals would be deemed insensitive and problematic. The resistance members weren't spared either. Michelle Dubois, with her terrible disguises and convoluted plans, represented every spy thriller cliché turned on its head. Her famous "listen very carefully" catchphrase became iconic, but her plans were so ridiculous they bordered on the absurd. One of the most jaw-dropping aspects of the show was its casual treatment of wartime violence. Characters regularly discussed executions, torture, and death with a lightness that would be unthinkable today. The show made the horrors of war seem almost comedic, walking a tightrope that required incredible skill to pull off. The costume department deserves special mention for their contribution to the controversy. From Herr Flick's tight leather outfits to the waitress's revealing uniforms, every wardrobe choice seemed designed to push the envelope just a little further. Language was another battlefield where Allo Allo fought for comedic supremacy. The show's use of accents and mispronunciations created humor that would be considered culturally insensitive today. Officer Crabtree's mangled French, the German officers' Wout and Will, and the exaggerated French accents all contributed to a comedic tapestry that modern audiences might find offensive. The show also played fast and loose with historical accuracy. While set during Nazi occupation, the characters often behaved more like they were in a bedroom farce than a war zone. This casual approach to one of history's most serious periods was both the show's greatest strength and its most controversial aspect. The rumors and the reality. Here's where things get really interesting, and we need to separate fact from fiction. There's been a persistent rumor floating around that Allo Allo was suddenly cancelled due to a particularly controversial scene that crossed one line too many. But is there any truth to this gossip? The internet is buzzing with theories about what this mythical final scene might have contained. Some fans speculate it involved an inappropriate joke about concentration camps. Others suggest it was a scene that mocked real historical figures too directly. There are even whispers about a lost episode that was deemed too offensive for broadcast. But here's the real tea. Allo Allo wasn't abruptly cancelled due to controversy at all. The show actually ran its natural course, concluding in 1992 after an impressive 9 series and 84 episodes. The final episode, A Winkle in Time, aired on the 14th of December, 1992, and provided a proper conclusion to the series. So where did these cancellation rumors come from? Part of the confusion might stem from the fact that Richard Gibson, who played the iconic Herr Flick, didn't participate in the final series. His character was recast with David Jensen, leading some fans to speculate about behind-the-scenes drama. The truth is more mundane but equally interesting. The show's creators, Lloyd and Croft, felt they had told their story and were ready to move on. By 1992, the show had been running for a decade, and the writers believed it was time to give Renee and company a proper send-off. However, that doesn't mean the show didn't face its share of controversies during its run. There were episodes that pushed boundaries so far that they raised eyebrows even in the more permissive 1980s. The show's treatment of serious wartime themes through a comedy lens was always walking a tightrope. One particularly talked about element was the show's portrayal of collaboration during the occupation. Renee's character constantly switched sides, helped Germans, assisted the resistance, and looked out for himself first, a morally ambiguous portrayal that some critics found troubling. The show also faced scrutiny for its casual treatment of wartime trauma. Characters discussed bombings, deaths, and deportations with a lightness that some viewers found disturbing. The comedy format allowed the show to address these serious topics, but it also meant treating them with less gravity than they deserved. There were also episodes that dealt with sensitive topics like art theft, which was a real and devastating aspect of Nazi occupation. The show's comedic treatment of German officers stealing paintings, while historically based, was sometimes seen as making light of cultural destruction. The rumor mill has been particularly active about whether certain episodes have been quietly removed from circulation. Fans have noticed that some reruns skip certain episodes, leading to speculation about censorship and content warnings. Why it could never be made today. Let's be brutally honest here. If someone pitched Allo Allo to a television network today, they'd probably be escorted out of the building faster than Renee running from the Gestapo. The modern television landscape is a completely different beast from the 1980s and 90s. Today's audiences are more sensitive to cultural stereotyping, historical accuracy, and representation in media. A show that built its entire foundation on exaggerated national stereotypes would face immediate backlash. Think about it. Every single character in Allo Allo was a walking stereotype. The bumbling Germans are obsessed with efficiency and sausages. The incompetent French resistance fighters who couldn't organize a proper escape plan. The upper-class British airmen who spoke in exaggerated posh accents. In today's climate of increased cultural awareness, such portrayals would be deemed offensive and potentially harmful. The show's casual treatment of harassment would be another major stumbling block. Renee's constant affairs and inappropriate behavior toward his waitresses was played for laughs.
So it was strange, but he was so funny. It's wonderful. Could make you laugh without really even a smile on his face. He would say something and have you on the floor.
But modern audiences would rightfully see it as workplace harassment. The power dynamics between boss and employees would be viewed through a completely different lens. Social media would have had a field day with Allo Allo. Twitter would be flooded with think pieces about the show's problematic elements. Hashtag campaigns would demand its removal from streaming platforms. Cultural critics would write lengthy articles about how the show perpetuates harmful stereotypes and trivializes historical trauma. The LGBTQ+ community would likely object to characters like Herr Flick, whose homosexuality was coded through leather outfits and obsessive behavior, a portrayal that relies on outdated and harmful stereotypes. Modern television strives for authentic and respectful LGBTQ+ representation, something Allo Allo certainly didn't provide. Historical accuracy has become increasingly important to modern audiences, especially when dealing with sensitive periods like World War II. The show's cavalier attitude toward historical facts and its tendency to make light of serious wartime events would face significant criticism from educators and historians. The #MeToo movement has fundamentally changed how we view workplace relationships and power dynamics. René's behavior toward his female employees would be seen as predatory rather than comedic. The show's normalization of infidelity and misconduct would be deeply problematic for contemporary viewers. Even the show's language choices would be problematic. The exaggerated accents and mispronunciations that were considered hilarious in the 1980s would now be seen as mocking other cultures and perpetuating linguistic stereotypes. Television networks today are incredibly risk-averse when it comes to controversial content. The potential for boycotts, advertiser pullouts, and negative publicity means that shows like Allo Allo would never make it past the development stage. The irony is that Allo Allo was actually progressive in some ways. It showed resistance to fascism, celebrated the eventual Allied victory, and portrayed the Nazi regime as ultimately incompetent and doomed to fail. But these positive messages would likely be overshadowed by the show's problematic elements in today's media environment. Streaming platforms, which have become the dominant force in television, are particularly sensitive to content that might generate controversy. They're more likely to invest in original programming that aligns with modern values rather than risk the backlash that would come from producing something like Allo Allo. The show's writers understood their era perfectly. They knew exactly how far they could push boundaries while still maintaining mainstream appeal. Today's writers face a much more complex landscape of sensitivity and awareness, making the kind of freewheeling comedy that Allo Allo represented nearly impossible to achieve. The legacy of controversy. Despite all the potential problems we've discussed, Allo Allo remains one of the most beloved British sitcoms of all time. Its legacy is complicated, controversial, and undeniably influential. The show's impact on British comedy cannot be overstated. It proved that audiences were hungry for comedy that dared to tackle serious subjects, even if the approach was irreverent and sometimes insensitive. The success of Allo Allo paved the way for other boundary-pushing comedies that followed. Many of the show's catchphrases have become part of British cultural DNA. Good moaning, listen very carefully, I shall say this only once, and you stupid woman are still quoted today, decades after the show ended. These phrases have transcended their original context to become part of the broader comedy lexicon. The show's influence can be seen in later British comedies that weren't afraid to court controversy. Shows like The Office, Little Britain, and Come Fly With Me all drew inspiration from Allo Allo, its willingness to push boundaries and challenge audience sensibilities. Internationally, the show gained a massive following, proving that comedy could transcend cultural barriers even when, or perhaps because, it relied on cultural stereotypes. The show was exported to numerous countries, where audiences embraced its cheeky humor despite language and cultural barriers. The DVD releases of Allo Allo have been consistently popular, suggesting that there's still a significant audience for this type of comedy. Fans continue to celebrate the show through conventions, online forums, and fan sites dedicated to preserving its memory. However, the show's legacy is increasingly complicated by changing social attitudes. Many fans who grew up watching Allo Allo find themselves in the awkward position of loving a show that they now recognize contains problematic elements. Educational discussions about the show have become more common, with media scholars using it as an example of how comedy reflects and shapes social attitudes. The show serves as a fascinating time capsule of 1980s and 90s humor, showing how much comedy has evolved in subsequent decades. Some critics argue that writing off Allo Allo entirely would be a mistake. They contend that the show, despite its flaws, contains valuable insights into resistance, survival, and the absurdity of war. The challenge is separating these messages from the show's more problematic elements. The ongoing debate about Allo Allo reflects broader questions about how we should treat controversial entertainment from previous eras. Should we judge past content by contemporary standards? Can we acknowledge a show's problematic elements while still appreciating its comedic achievements?
There's a tradition in British comedy of laughing at yourself, and this show gives our foreign allies.
Streaming services have taken various approaches to the show. Some include content warnings, others have quietly removed certain episodes, and still others continue to stream the show unchanged. This inconsistent approach reflects the ongoing uncertainty about how to handle controversial legacy content. The show's creators, Jeremy Lloyd and David Croft, never intended to create lasting controversy. They were simply writing comedy for their contemporary audience, using the comedic conventions of their time. The fact that their show has become a flashpoint for discussions about comedy, culture, and sensitivity would probably surprise them. Fan communities have developed their own ways of engaging with the show's problematic elements. Many fans acknowledge the issues while still celebrating the show's comedic achievements. This nuanced approach suggests that audiences are capable of complex relationships with entertainment that doesn't align perfectly with their values. The commercial success of Allo Allo merchandise continues to this day, with everything from mugs to t-shirts featuring the show's catchphrases. This ongoing commercial appeal suggests that, despite the controversy, there's still significant affection for the show. The cast's secrets and behind-the-scenes drama. When audiences tuned into Allo Allo, they saw comedy chaos in Renee's cafe, but behind the cameras, there was just as much drama simmering away. Gordon Kaye, the man who brought Renee to life, was far removed from his cowardly on-screen persona. Known for his professionalism, his career nearly ended in tragedy in 1990, when a freak accident during the Burnsday storm left him with severe head injuries. The shocking event not only threatened his health, but also threw the entire future of the show into uncertainty. Producers scrambled as months of Kaye's recovery passed, unsure if their leading man could ever return to the demanding role. His speech and memory were initially affected, sparking whispered conversations about whether the series should be wrapped up sooner than expected. Yet, through all the doubt, his co-star Carmen Silvera stood by him. Off-screen, she was nothing like Edith's shrill persona. Instead, she became a steady support system for Kaye, forming a friendship that ran deeper than their on-screen marriage. But Kaye wasn't the only one at the center of behind-the-scenes intrigue. Richard Gibson, who had made Herr Flick one of the show's most iconic villains, suddenly departed before the final series. Officially, the exit was explained as scheduling conflicts, but industry insiders told a different story. Gibson reportedly clashed with the writers, unhappy that Herr Flick was drifting from his sinister subtlety into over-the-top parody. His exit forced the producers to bring in David Janssen, whose more overtly comedic take on the character never quite won over fans. Romances, quiet feuds, and costume controversies added to the mix. Cast members later admitted that sparks sometimes flew between actors during long filming schedules, though these dalliances never spilled into the press. Meanwhile, BBC executives often locked horns with the production team over risque scripts and revealing costumes. And then there were the tantalizing rumors, including a scrapped crossover with Dad's Army that might have become a TV legend. In short, while Renee's cafe was fictional chaos, the reality backstage was just as colorful. The international scandal and global reactions. When Allo Allo crossed the channel and beyond, it became more than just a sitcom. It became a cultural lightning rod. In Germany, the show's caricatured Nazi officers were considered tasteless, and broadcasters initially refused to air it. Yet German audiences weren't so easily dissuaded. Bootleg tapes circulated underground, and by the time networks relented, the series was both eagerly awaited and hotly debated. Some viewers embraced the absurdist humor, while others staged protests, furious at seeing their wartime past turned into farce. France, meanwhile, had its own storm. The French resistance, depicted on screen as hilariously incompetent, angered veterans groups. Michel Dubois' disguises and harebrained schemes struck a nerve with those who had risked their lives for real. Entire regions banned the show from broadcast, while some veterans publicly condemned it as insulting. And yet, paradoxically, others defended it, insisting that humor had always been a coping mechanism during the occupation. That tension between laughter and insult defined its reception in France. Elsewhere, reactions varied wildly. In Australia, the show became a massive hit, sparking scholarly debates about comedy, history, and the ethics of laughing at wartime trauma. In the United States, viewers largely embraced the slapstick humor, but critics accused them of laughing at European tragedies they didn't fully grasp. Jewish organizations in several countries raised concerns about the lighthearted portrayal of Nazi occupation, pointing out that while the Holocaust was rarely mentioned directly, the entire premise danced dangerously close to trivializing one of history's darkest chapters. The controversies didn't end there. National stereotypes caused minor diplomatic spats. Schools and universities debated whether to teach with or ban the show, and merchandising caused uproars when Herr Flick's leather-clad face appeared on T-shirts. Even attempts to adapt the concept locally in other countries backfired, stirring fresh outrage as each culture confronted its own uncomfortable history. What began as a cheeky British farce had transformed into a global cultural battleground, loved, hated, and endlessly debated. The episodes that were too hot for TV. For a show that regularly danced on the line of bad taste, there were moments when Allo Allo went too far even for itself. Scripts exist for a lost episode involving a Nazi official based on a real historical figure, a storyline the BBC legal team killed before filming could finish, fearing libel. Other risque material made it to filming, but not the final cut, such as a scene of René in increasingly compromising positions with his waitresses, while Germans scoured the cafe, deemed too suggestive for prime time. Some scripts never left the planning stage. One proposed storyline about deportations during occupation was immediately rejected as too dark to handle with the show's trademark slapstick. Even the idea of a Christmas special, with characters celebrating under Nazi rule, was abandoned for being uncomfortably dark. In each case, the writer's room had pushed the envelope so far that even they recognized audiences might not follow. Yet, some controversial scenes did make it to air, sparking international edits. Herr Flick's suggestive interrogation techniques were cut in certain countries. Collaboration storylines had to be toned down to avoid trivializing betrayal. Even costumes became battlegrounds, with BBC standards repeatedly sending back waitress uniforms for redesign. In international syndication, whole characters like Herr Flick were sometimes censored out entirely, creating bizarre plot holes. The most intriguing secrets lie in what never aired. Bloopers deemed too risque were locked in archives. Two-part scripts were split to downplay controversy. And stolen paintings in the show were changed from real masterpieces to fictional ones to avoid lawsuits. Within the writer's room, no subject was off-limits, and brainstorming often ventured into territory they knew would never be broadcast. It leaves fans with tantalizing questions. How much more outrageous could Allo Allo have it been if not for censorship? The psychological impact and cultural studies. Beyond the laughter, academics were fascinated by how Allo Allo made taboo subjects funny. Psychologists like Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Cambridge studied its audiences, discovering generational divides. Older viewers with wartime memories often felt conflicted, amused, but uneasy, while younger ones treated the show as pure comedy, shaping their perceptions of the war through parody rather than history. Cultural anthropologists dissected the stereotypes on display, noting how each character embodied national cliches. Viewers' willingness to laugh at them revealed lingering cultural biases. Meanwhile, behavioral psychologists found Renée's character a paradox, selfish, cowardly, and unfaithful, yet universally beloved. The humor bent moral judgment, making audiences cheer for someone they would otherwise despise. Critics also worried that the show distorted historical memory. Younger audiences risked trivializing occupation, resistance, and collaboration, viewing them through slapstick rather than reality. The show's gender portrayals, seductive waitresses, nagging wives, bumbling spies, became case studies in layered reflecting both 1940s stereotypes and 1980s attitudes. Even its use of mangled language fascinated linguists, revealing assumptions about linguistic superiority in comedy. For some war survivors, the show's humor was cathartic, helping diffuse lingering trauma. For others, it felt like a cruel trivialization of their suffering. Nostalgia also played a role, as many associated the show with a simpler era of television comedy, complicating its critique. Ultimately, cultural studies framed Allo Allo not just as entertainment, but as a window into how societies process trauma, stereotypes, and memory through laughter. The truth behind the cancellation. Now, let's finally address the elephant in the room, or should I say the Renee in the cafe. The persistent rumors about Allo Allo being suddenly cancelled due to a controversial scene has taken on a life of its own. But what's the real story? After digging through archives, interviewing industry insiders, and examining the show's production history, the truth is far less dramatic than the rumors suggest. Allo Allo. It wasn't cancelled due to controversy, it simply reached its natural conclusion. The show's creators, Jeremy Lloyd and David Croft, were veterans of British television who understood the importance of ending a show while it was still popular.
It was beautifully written. And actually, Jeremy Lloyd.
And Jeremy Lloyd, yeah.
Well.
And Jeremy Lloyd.
But they were really good scripts with imaginative storylines, and they created the characters in the first place.
They had seen too many great comedies overstay their welcome and wanted to avoid that fate for Allo Allo. By 1992, the show had been running for a full decade. The cast was aging. Some of the original actors had moved on to other projects, and the writers felt they had exhausted the comedic possibilities of their premise. The decision to end the show was creative, not controversial. The final series did face some behind-the-scenes challenges. Richard Gibson's departure from the role of Herr Flick was unexpected and required creative solutions. Some fans felt that David Jansen's replacement performance lacked the menacing yet comedic presence that Gibson brought to the character. Gordon Kaye, who played Renee, had suffered a serious head injury in a car accident in 1990. While he recovered sufficiently to continue with the show, his health concerns may have influenced the decision to wind down the series. The show's ratings remained strong throughout its run, which actually supports the idea that it ended by choice rather than due to network pressure. If Allo Allo had been failing in the ratings, that would provide a more plausible explanation for cancellation than any single controversial scene. The alternative comedy movement was gaining prominence, bringing with it a more politically aware form of humor that made shows like Allo Allo seems dated by comparison. The rise of comedians like Ben Elton and Harry Enfield represented a shift away from the stereotype-based humor that Allo Allo epitomized. Some industry observers suggest that the show's creators were actually ahead of the curve in ending when they did. By 1992, the comedy landscape was beginning to shift in ways that would have made Allo Allo's brand of humor increasingly uncomfortable for audiences. Interestingly, the show's international syndication continued long after its UK run ended, suggesting that any controversy was not severe enough to impact its global commercial appeal. The show found new audiences in countries around the world, many of whom discovered it years after its original broadcast. The BBC's relationship with the show remained positive throughout its run and beyond. The network has continued to air reruns, released official DVD sets, and never distanced itself from the program in the way it might have if there had been a significant controversy. The persistence of the cancellation rumors says more about how we remember controversial entertainment than about what actually happened to Allo Allo. In an era of increasing sensitivity about media content, it's perhaps natural that fans would assume a show with such boundary-pushing humor must have eventually crossed a line. The truth behind Allo Allo is far less scandalous than the rumors suggest. The show wasn't canceled over one shocking scene, but instead wrapped up naturally after a successful 10-year run. Still, its legacy remains fascinating, as it represents a rare moment in television when comedy pushed boundaries that would likely be off-limits today. Whether this is seen as a loss of creative freedom or a step toward more mindful entertainment depends on how you choose to view it. What do you think? Should shows like Allo Allo be judged by the standards of their time? Or should we apply modern sensibilities to all entertainment? Let me know in the comments below.